Just want to say how honored we are to have Secretary Castro with us this evening, and how honored we are to have all of you join us here at the University of New Hampshire School of Law. What a fantastic turnout. This is my very first 2020, my very first primary in being in New Hampshire, and it is such a phenomenal opportunity. I have never seen a place more civically engaged. We are really how it should be across this country. Thank you. I want to introduce Director John Greabe. He is a professor of law here, and he is director of our Rudman Center, responsible for this partnership with the ACLU. Thanks, John.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Megan. So as Megan just shared, my name's John Greabe, and I direct the Warren B. Rudman Center for Justice, Leadership, and Public Service here at the law school. The center supports students who are interested in public service lawyering with curricular support, experiential support, and financial support. And we also serve as a face of the University of New Hampshire here in Concord, the state's capital, at least insofar as we put on public programming that aligns with our mission. We are so pleased to partner with the ACLU of New Hampshire to offer this series on civil liberties and the presidency. Tonight, we welcome Julian Castro, who announced his candidacy for the presidency in January. He was the U.S. Secretary of Housing and Urban Development from 2014 to 2017, and was also the mayor of his hometown of San Antonio, Texas, from 2009 to 2014. Moderating tonight's presentation will be Jeanne Hruska from the ACLU. Both the Rudman Center and the ACLU of New Hampshire are nonpartisan, and neither endorses political candidates or parties. And with that, please join me in welcoming Secretary Castro. Welcome to the law school. We're honored to have you here.
Sure. Thank you. Hello, good afternoon. First of all, thank you, John. I also want to say thanks to the dean of our law school, Dean Carpenter, who I know is here. Ah, okay. I don't even need the microphone. And also to, of course, let's give a huge round of applause to the ACLU of New Hampshire. All right. And to all of you for being here. I imagine that many folks in this room, this is not the first time that you've been to a conversation about civil liberties in our state, in this state, or in our country. I imagine there are a lot of folks here who have worked hard to ensure that our civil liberties are protected and that they're strong in this 21st century. Gracias. Thank you very much for all of the work that I know many folks in this room have done to ensure that our civil liberties are protected. I'm Julian Castro. I feel like I need a name tag these days because I have a twin brother. His name is Joaquin, and y'all may have seen him on MSNBC or CNN. He's in Congress. It was actually his resolution last week that the Senate voted on to block the declaration of a national emergency by President Trump. So I'd like to think, that my baby brother, I mean that he's 1 minute younger than I am. He's doing well for himself. My brother and I grew up on the west side of San Antonio with my mother and my grandmother. My grandmother had come over from Mexico when she was 7 years old with her younger sister because their parents had passed away and their closest relatives lived in San Antonio. And so they came across the border at the small town of Eagle Pass, Texas. She ended up on the west side of San Antonio, never finished elementary school, and so she worked as a maid, a cook, and a babysitter, and raised my mom as a single parent. My mom raised my brother and me as a single parent. We went to the public schools of San Antonio and then had the chance to go to college and to law school, to come back home to San Antonio. And I got elected and served on the San Antonio City Council starting when I was 26 years old, and then eventually, a few years later, got elected mayor of the city and served 5 years as the mayor of my hometown until the middle of 2014. I got a call on April 16th, 2014 from President Obama. And I remember the date because it's not every day that the president calls you and asks you if you want a job. I had just driven through the drive-thru at Panda Express, and the phone, you know how sometimes the phone says blocked or unknown? It said private. And so if you ever get a phone call that says private, pick it up. Right? I ended up serving for 2.5 years as the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. And during that time, getting to travel to 39 different states, 100 communities, big and small, getting a real sense of the challenges that communities are grappling with when it comes to not only housing, of course HUD handles housing, but also everything that's connected to that. Transportation, infrastructure, education, the environment that folks grow up in, neighborhoods, and how we can invest in them, and get to see communities that were doing great work and succeeding, and others that were doing so-so, and some that were way behind. And so I got a great look at what's happening in our country. I'm running for president because I believe that it's time for new energy and new leadership in the White House, because I feel very blessed with the enormous opportunity that I've had in my own life to go to the public schools, to go to college, to go to law school, to become the first in my family to be a professional as an attorney, and to serve my community, both at a local level and a national level. And because I'm convinced that we need leadership that can move us forward as one nation with one destiny. And that destiny in this 21st century is to be the smartest, the healthiest, the fairest, and the most prosperous nation on earth. It's the smartest, the healthiest, the fairest, and the most prosperous nation on earth. Tonight we're going to have a conversation that really touches on all of those things, but focuses, of course, most especially on how we can ensure that we are the most fair, the fairest nation in this 21st century. So I believe that in the years to come, we need to do bold things to ensure that we're more fair. We need to reform our justice system, starting with the way that police departments across the United States treat people. You know, I believe in transparency, that we should equip our police departments with body cams, that we should take the recommendations of the task force on policing in the 21st century that the Obama administration established to improve relationships between police departments and communities across our country, that we should ensure that more officers are recruited from neighborhoods that they're going to be patrolling so that they have a better understanding of folks who live in those neighborhoods. I had the chance as a city councilman and mayor to work with many, many police officers. I know many of them do a great job. I also know that too often times, though, if you're a young black man walking in the streets of a community in this country, that you're treated differently, and that that's wrong. I was in South Carolina just yesterday, and in Charleston, and it has struck me that if Dylan Roof, who shot up a church, Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, can be taken in without incident, apprehended without incident, as he should be, then so can Eric Garner and Stephon Clark, right? And so many other people. And so starting with how our police departments interact with citizens across this country, and non-citizens, by the way, we can do better. Secondly, we need to ensure that you are innocent until proven guilty, no matter who you are. Right? We need to reform our bail system. I know we're going to have a conversation about that. We need to invest in our public defender system so that instead of being completely overworked with too many cases, and sometimes the wrong incentives to have clients plea to a charge, that our defense counsel actually are able to fully and adequately and well represent their clients, no matter what state you live in, whether you're in my home state of Texas, here in New Hampshire, in California, or wherever you are. I also believe that we need to decriminalize some of the things that have clogged up our criminal justice system, like marijuana. Right? We have a blueprint now in states like Colorado that have demonstrated how you can do this. Of course, we're going to regulate it, right? We need to regulate it sensibly so that it can be used safely, but we've seen that that can be done. And I was heartened the other day to see a poll that suggested that something like 85% of people under the age of 35 already support the legalization of marijuana. And folks older than that as well support it in significant numbers. A number of states have already begun this process. I think it's time to do that. We also need to look at sentencing reform. And the recent legislation that was passed in Congress is, I think, maybe appropriately called the first step legislation. We need to build on all of those things. So I look forward tonight to having that conversation of how we can create the fairest nation on earth in this 21st century. And our civil liberties have always been one of the things that distinguishes this great nation of ours, that all of us cherish, whether it has been free speech or the exercise of religion or fighting for civil rights. I grew up with a mother who was involved in the old Chicano movement, the Mexican-American civil rights movement of the late 1960s and early 1970s. And she ran for city council when she was 23 years old in 1971 with this slate called the Committee for Barrio Betterment. And their whole agenda was to make sure that all neighborhoods in San Antonio were well invested in for simple things like drainage and streets and public safety. All of them lost. There were 4 candidates. At that time, very few women and very few people of color could actually win because there were no single-member districts. You know, you had to run at large. And, but even though they lost in April of 1971, when she was asked by one of the reporters from a local newspaper about their defeat, she said, "Oh, we'll be back." And 30 years later, when I was 26, in 2001, I got elected as the youngest city council member in that city's history at that point. That didn't happen by accident. It happened because generations of folks have fought to make progress in our country so that we extended our civil liberties and the ability to prosper to people no matter who they are. We're reminded of the importance of that just last week. And I believe one of the most important things that we can do is make sure that in the years to come, that instead of fostering and fanning the flames of division and hate and bigotry and creating other, whether that's immigrants or people of color or people who are poor, that we come together as a country and that we embrace that kind of leadership. That manifests itself in leaders, in politicians, but more importantly, it manifests itself in our laws and the way that we protect them and the way that they're enshrined in our Constitution. So muchísimas gracias for having me here today, and I look forward to answering some questions. All right? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
There you are. I was waiting for somebody to give me direction on what's next, all right?
So thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. We have a combination of questions that you have submitted in index cards, and I know there are a number of people who want to ask questions in person. So we will start with an easy one, what we think of as an easy one, which is, do you support repealing the Patriot Act?
Yeah, I do.
Easy.
I think that, you know, that piece of legislation was a product of a moment in time where I can understand the intention of it, but I believe that we went overboard, that Congress went overboard. And you know, we'll talk about privacy, I'm sure, in the context of the 21st century technology and social media and our tech companies, but yeah, I believe that we can take a longer term view that is more in keeping with the spirit of our Constitution and the letter of our Constitution than that bill.
Excellent. I do think privacy will come up again tonight. If you are asking a question from the audience, I would ask that you stand up and do speak very loudly. This room, actually, the acoustics are pretty good, but do speak up. Show of hands, who has questions? We'll start right here in the front.
Protection to dreamers. I understand that dreamers, they...
Give her a mic. Louder.
Sorry. I understand that dreamers, it's not their fault. They got here legally. But probably the way we get in, the approach that we get in path to citizenship, a lot of people don't understand why we get given the citizenship when they came illegally. Maybe if we approach it as maybe give them temporary status, give them a green card, and maybe 10 years later they can get the citizenship, maybe people will approve that better and understand why they get in the citizenship. What do you think about that?
Thank you for the question. Oh, okay. Well, that's right. I always forget I have my own mic on. I'm forgetting that today. Thank you very much for the question. This question is about dreamers, and I think the vast majority of Americans believe that we should find a way to ensure that dreamers can stay here in the United States. We have 800,000 dreamers across the country, about 200,000 of them in my home state of Texas. These are folks who are young, who many times have been in school doing well, some of them serving in the military, working, many of them protected by DACA. And the question is, for the future, how do we ensure that we can protect them? And the point that you brought up is that sometimes people may not support automatic citizenship. What I believe in is a pathway to citizenship. I think that we can negotiate around what that looks like. I think both for dreamers and for the 10 to 11 million undocumented immigrants who are here, if they haven't committed a serious crime, all right, if they have committed a serious crime, then I don't think that this applies. But if they haven't committed a serious crime, then I believe that we should put folks on a path to citizenship. What that looks like in terms of the number of years, I believe will be a subject of negotiation. That was true in 2013 under the Comprehensive Immigration Reform legislation. And I have no doubt that there will be steps to that. So I take your point, but I do think that folks should be able to get on a path to citizenship. Let me also say, because people often ask, they say, look, why are you talking about path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants? What about the legal immigration system? My family, they say my uncle or a cousin of mine or my spouse, they went and they applied for legal citizenship. And I understand that sentiment. These two things are not mutually exclusive. We need to improve the legal immigration system to speed it up, to accelerate it, to make sure that we can harness talent from around the world in different ways, but then also compassionately and humanely deal with the 10 to 11 million people who are here who are undocumented, who have not committed a serious crime, which is the vast, vast majority of people. And I don't agree with the false choice that this president has presented, like, either we're going to have border security or we're going to be compassionate and humane and deal with undocumented immigrants in that way. We can have strong border security and also compassionately deal with the undocumented immigrants who are here and create a pathway to citizenship. One of the things that's given me real hope in the last year was that on Father's Day, I went down to this place called the Ursula Processing Center, which is in McAllen, Texas, on the border of Texas. And I was there to join activists to protest the family separation policy. This Ursula Processing Center is a place where they're physically separating little kids from their parents, which I think is completely the wrong policy, is antithetical, completely against what we are, who we are as Americans, or who we should be. What gave me hope, though, was that the activists who were there were for all different backgrounds. They looked completely different, from different parts of the country, different backgrounds. They brought different views to the table, but it showed me in that moment that the values that we share as Americans transcend skin color or what part of the country we come from. They bring us together. And it's in that spirit that I believe in 2021 that at 12:01 p.m. on January 20th, we're going to have a Democratic president, a Democratic House, and a Democratic Senate. And the lesson of 2009, 2010 with regard to immigration reform is don't wait. If I'm president, we're not going to wait.
So we're going to go back and forth so that folks who submitted questions get theirs asked. Here's another one. Will you support the accommodation of trans inmates, including access to hormone replacement therapy and gender affirmation surgery?
Yeah, I do support that. I support accommodation for transgender individuals. Let me give you two examples of what I've already done. I was mayor of San Antonio for 5 years. In 2013, we passed an ordinance, a non-discrimination ordinance in our city. It basically said that in San Antonio, people could not be discriminated against because of their sexual orientation or their gender identity. There were some folks that said, look, why don't you just make it apply to people who are gay and lesbian and bisexual, but not transgender? And we said, no, it has to apply to everybody, including the transgender community. And it did apply to the transgender community. When I was at HUD, we promulgated an extension of the equal access rule to make sure that folks from the LGBTQ community, if they present themselves at a shelter, for instance, could get accommodations that are in accordance with their preference. And that's what I believe about how people should be treated.
Civil liberties questions from the audience. I know there's lots. We'll go up. In the caramel sweater?
My name's Lindsay House. I ran the transgender non-discrimination campaign that was successful here in New Hampshire. I really appreciate everything that you just said. I'm a non-binary transgender person, meaning that I was born and raised as a girl, but I just feel like a person. And New Hampshire's on the verge of passing a bill that would allow people to have an X gender marker on their driver's license. Is that something that you would support on the federal level?
Yeah, it's a great question. I have not seen that legislation, but that sounds like something that I could be supportive of. I believe that that people should be allowed to identify as they prefer to identify. As you know, a lot of folks in our society are still catching up with that notion, right? But I do think that we have many, many good-hearted Americans that want to do the right thing in terms of ensuring that people can identify the way that they're most comfortable with. And, just as importantly, that we remove the stigma that too often is attached to somebody choosing an identity that is different from what people are normally used to. And so as president, I would make sure that we're a strong partner with states, with local communities, to remove that stigma and also support efforts to have people be able to identify as they choose.
Back to privacy. This is an issue that has come up in a number of these conversations, which is in this 21st century, more and more personalized data is online, right? Whether it's with Amazon or Google. So the question is, how would you handle companies that exploit consumers' personal data?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something that affects everybody in this room, I'm sure. If you have a cell phone, a tablet, you have an email account, to a lot of Americans, it's scary, right? That these companies have more granular information on you and your preferences and are able to track exactly what you've been looking at online, what you've been buying, the pages that you've been visiting, personal information about you, the content of emails, the location that you've gone, right? If you had your cell phone with you, the locations that you've gone. Right? Now they say that they don't disaggregate a lot of that data, but the fact is that many times they can actually drill down if they wanted to, or that information in the hands of people with malevolent intent can be misused. So here's what I believe. First of all, I believe that if that data is going to be allowed to be collected by companies, especially if companies have built their business model on this, there should be a much more straightforward an upfront consent process that is there so that people choose or not choose to participate in that. I also agree with looking at some of these ways that people have suggested that consumers themselves get to share in some of the profits of this. Because it's your personal information, it's your data that basically is being sold. You are creating that for these companies, right? Whether we tax that and that's a public good, or literally people get some sort of recompense or compensation for that, I'm open to considering different plans to do that. You know, I have not settled on one way of how we would do that, but I'm open to considering that. I also believe that there need to be greater penalties for especially these huge companies, whether they're credit card companies, whether it's a huge retailer or other big companies that don't take necessary steps or sufficient steps to secure your data, and then your personal information ends up in the hands of people that do want to use it for the wrong purposes. I believe in stricter penalties, punishment for companies when that happens, and essentially curtailing the ability also of companies to use data in the ways that they've been able to use it so far. So it's something that concerns me. You know, I have been pleased to see some of the steps that California, for instance, has taken on this. I know that there's legislation in Congress that has been proposed, and I'm generally supportive of those efforts to limit the use of that data by private companies.
One follow-up on that you actually hit on without using the term. The proposal out there is to give people a property interest in their data, right? So that's where then you get paid for it because it's your property that all these companies are using. Would you support that proposal?
Well, you know, I actually have not heard it expressed in that way, but I agree with the idea, sure. I have not seen any legislation on that, what that looks like, but just the concept of that, yeah. I mean, you know, it gets to me. I mean, I think it gets to a lot of consumers to think about how much data is collected and that you are basically the product that these companies are selling. Your information is the product. And you need to have more consent as to whether that data is going to be collected. And that's hard because a lot of times on our phones, we have a million different apps on there. And sometimes, even when you say, no, don't track it, it turns out that some of the information is being tracked. That needs to be tightened up. And then secondly, yeah, some way that even if you do engage in that, that the consumer himself or herself can benefit.
Excellent. Questions? Should we go to this side of the audience? We don't have anybody brave enough. Planned Parenthood. How can you not support Planned Parenthood?
I believe that the way that we speak about abortion and people who get abortions is a large contributor to restrictive state laws. So as you're campaigning, or how do you and how will you speak about abortion in a way that will reduce that stigma or at least not contribute to it?
Yeah, no, you know, when I announced on January 12th, one of the things that I said was that we need to protect a woman's right to choose, including because reproductive health care and freedom is an economic issue in the 21st century. And, you know, I've talked about the importance of protecting that right of a woman in consultation with her doctor to be able to make that choice. If I'm president, and I have the opportunity to make appointments to the Supreme Court, that's one of the things that I'm going to be very mindful of. I think all of us are concerned. You know, those of us who support choice are concerned about the future of the Supreme Court and decisions that might come down because of the composition of the court today. So during the course of this campaign, I'll continue to talk about the importance of that right in all of its different ways as not only an economic issue, but also a civil liberties issue, and connect the dots of that to the decisions that we make on the Supreme Court and in other ways. Right.
I want to get into an issue now that you've brought up along the campaign trail that I know there's a lot of interest in, which is reparations. We were talking before the event that it's actually incredible progress that this conversation is being had. I think it was just a few years ago where the word reparations was controversial, and now there's actually a discussion about it. So you've mentioned that you support them. We would like to have more detail as to what you mean when you say you support reparations.
Yeah, I was asked this question a few times over the last few weeks, and the question was, yeah, do you support reparations for descendants of slaves? And what I said was that this is not an issue that I see through a political lens. I just see this as right and wrong. That I have long believed that in order to heal as a nation going forward, and because of the injustice that was done many years ago, that we should offer reparations to the descendants of slaves. I've said that under our Constitution, if we compensate people because we take their property, why wouldn't you compensate people who actually were property? And some people say, well, nobody alive today was a slave. You know, if they take your property and then you pass away the next day, your estate can still pursue recompense against the government for that taking. That wrong never goes away. It hasn't gone away. It has not gone away. So what I support is legislation that Sheila Jackson Lee has introduced that would both appoint a commission and create a study on reparations and how that might best be done. I think that this is not something that if we do it, that should be done by one politician, one person. It would have to be a process that brings people together, a task force, a commission of people from around the nation that understand this, that have the respect of different communities within the United States, that as part of that process, we can heal as a country. Some people say, hey, Julian, you've talked a lot about the future, that you're about the future. Then if you're about the future, well, why are you talking about this past? It's not just the past. It very much impacts us today. And importantly for our country, if we were able to do this in the good way, in the right way, I think that this would be tremendously beneficial to our future as a country. Because that original sin of slavery, in so many ways, and the discrimination that followed it, still impacts the heart and the soul and the everyday experience of not only communities of color, but also, I think, of white people in this country. And that if we could come together and address this once and for all, I believe that we would be better off as a country. And you know, that's what I've told people. Right?
I want to be responsive to the question, and there was a follow-up which said, what about the GI Bill and using that as a model for reparations? What are your thoughts on that?
So some folks say, well, look, is what you have in mind something that is direct to the descendants of slaves, and how would you figure that out? Or is it something that's more general? And my answer to that is, you know, in my rendering of this, it's something that is more direct. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's a literal check, but some sort of recompense. However, I do believe in a process to get there. And so it's not, I think that we need to get there through a task force or a commission that can look at it and understand it and come up with recommendations on how to best address this. I won't pretend that this is not a very, very controversial issue. It is. That there's a tremendous amount of disagreement on whether it should be done in the first place, and if we did do it, how it would be done. So I think this is one of those issues where the process is as important as the end result. And if we are going to do it, we need a process that is very inclusive and that ends up with a result that the nation can believe in and that the nation helps heal because of. And that can't be done, I think, just because even if it's the president, one person believes in this way. I think it has to be done in a more inclusive way, in a healing way, if we do it.
A hand keeps raising here in the third row.
I want to talk to you about incarceration. How would you get the federal government out of allowing corporations to run federal prison. Yes.
Yeah. You know, there's certain things in this country that I don't think are best determined by a profit motive. You know, obviously there are a lot of things that are, you know, the profit motive is good. You go buy a car, right? You buy a house, everything we buy, groceries and so forth. That's the system that we live in. We have to address inequalities in that system and make sure that more people can prosper, that everybody can prosper. However, when it comes to something like healthcare, you know, I don't believe that whether you have money or don't have money should impact whether you can get health care, not health insurance, but health care when you need it and the medication that you need. And also, I don't believe that a profit motive should influence our criminal justice system and whether somebody ends up incarcerated or not. And I think that in too many communities, we've gone too far with this incentive almost of putting more people behind bars because there's an industry, a cottage industry out there of folks who have an interest in more people being behind bars, whether that's in the context of immigrant detention centers, like we've seen, or in the context of private prisons. And so I would work to reduce and eventually eliminate that. Now, I mean, if we think about that for a second, right? What is the best way to do that? I think the best answer is not just to build more prisons. The best answer actually is to cut off that pipeline so that more young people have an effective first chance in life to improve our schools, to reform our criminal justice system and our sentencing, to give folks better counsel so that, you know, you don't have to be wealthy and able to hire good lawyers, you know, if you're innocent, to abolish the death penalty, which I was glad to see California do the other, you know. I was in California about, I'm losing track of time. I think it was like 3 weeks ago. I've traveled like all of the other candidates. I've traveled a lot. But I was at an event with the gentleman that heads up the community college system in California, or actually in LA. And he said something that stunned me. He said that in the last 25 years, since 1994, that California had built, in that time, one new University of California, or California, I think it's Cal State, or maybe it was University of California at Merced, basically a state university. And in the same time period have built 22 prisons. And this is in California. You can imagine in some of the other states if you started doing that math. So I think the answer is, and this is part of my vision for the future of this country, is that we need to invest in people in the first place. We need better child care options. We need universal pre-K. We need to improve K through 12 education. We need to reform the way that a lot of police departments deal with, especially young people of color. We need to improve the sentencing in our nation, in our states. We need to improve the whole system so that we don't have to go build a whole bunch more public prisons in the future. And we can reduce and eventually eliminate those private ones.
I'll make one plug, which is we're really close to repealing the death penalty here in New Hampshire. So if you all haven't called your senator and your state rep a dozen times, that's your homework assignment after today. And then we actually have a really good follow-up question to that, which is, do you think it's acceptable to replace physical jails with virtual jails through mass surveillance of targeted local communities? How do you propose stopping the use of mass surveillance from turning targeted communities of color and poor communities into open-air prisons?
Well, you know, honestly, I had not heard it expressed that way. That's a powerful way to express it. But I take the point, right? Everything from red light cameras to the use of cameras, surveillance on communities. Again, I think that that there are better ways to engage communities to help both keep them safe and make sure that the people within those neighborhoods can prosper than to create this kind of police state, whether it's an actual physical police state or a virtual police state. And you know, I just think the way that we do that is to curtail any incentive that we would offer for local governments to go too far, right? I do think sometimes, of course, surveillance is appropriate, the ability to monitor and so forth. I agree with some surveillance, like body cameras for police officers. I think they help both police officer and also somebody who is being apprehended sometimes when an officer crosses a line. But I do not agree with the over-surveillance and sometimes over-harassment of communities, especially poor communities and communities of color in this country. And so this is a new way that the issue has been presented to me, but I understand the spirit of it and look forward to learning more about it.
I think it's an interesting question based on the earlier question about corporations using our personal data, which is law enforcement uses that same data, right? They can track your cell phone, they can use facial recognition. So where's the balance between law enforcement and personal privacy?
Well, I mean, I think that there should not be a presumption of guilt sometimes that is already worked into the system, right? And so I think that people are innocent until they're proven guilty, or there's a search warrant process that law enforcement must go through, right? And they have to have some reason, legitimate reason, to be able to conduct a search. And so I think that we need to be very careful about going over the line just because it is virtual and it's not a physical search of somebody's property. And I applaud a lot of the judges around the country who have helped us protect this civil liberty and have spelled out in the 21st century what the Fourth Amendment means, right? Because there's some updating, some adjusting, some transitioning that people are having to do in the jurisprudence of this. And so I applaud those judges that have done that. And I tend to side on being careful about that and enshrining privacy in the individual liberty. Right? Yeah.
Questions?
Thank you for being here tonight for this important conversation, Mr. Secretary. Are you sure you want to be president? You don't have any gray hair.
I think the other day somebody said, somebody on Twitter, people always say a million things on Twitter. They said, I see you with that fake gray hair. I said, no, I earned this. I barely have any, but it's mine. Yeah.
My question is actually really an age-old question. I have 3 teenage boys, and the internet sort of scares me a little bit. How do we balance free speech? How do we protect free speech, but at the same time guarantee civil discourse? So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yeah, I know that this is one of the hottest issues on college campuses, for instance, these days, and also, just in general out there. I saw a news report today that didn't get to read the case, but about a federal court that just ruled again that somebody can stick the middle finger, even I think at a law enforcement officer or somebody else, and that's considered free speech. Folks will remember, for those of y'all that have gone to law school, right, that case of the guy wearing the jacket about the draft and with the expletive. And I believe a lot in free speech. What I also believe in is the ability of each and every person to be able to live up to their potential. And it's when those two things come into conflict that we have the biggest challenge. I tend to err on the side of free speech. At the same time, I think all of us are very keenly aware that today, for instance, whether it's on Twitter or other platforms, you have folks that are spreading hate, that are embracing ideologies that sometimes have prompted things like happened in New Zealand, right? Or the shooting that happened in the Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston. And so I do think that these platforms like Twitter and Facebook can get better about regulating that. These protections, right, are protections of the state. The state cannot infringe on free speech. That does not mean that every person with the most bigoted or hateful opinions should be able to recruit folks on a platform like Facebook, especially if they begin to talk about taking action or encourage others to take action. Right? It's the closer that you get to that classic formulation of shouting fire in a crowded theater, whether that's physically in person or online, I think that the more dangerous that becomes. And how do we draw that line? You know, I would be lying to you if I told you that I could give you a recitation of that precisely in every way right now. But I do think that we protect free speech, but we also have to be vigilant about these voices of destruction and of bigotry that are using platforms that are new to us in unprecedented ways that have also created violence. And I think that these platforms need to be sharper about regulating that without stifling the ability of people to express themselves. I don't believe that just because somebody expresses a bigoted thought that that person should be automatically shut down, right? Because the truth is that bigotry exists in our world. At the same time, we have to recognize that that also has an impact on people within a community. And each person has a value, and they need to be able to live up to their potential. So to me, it's a matter of protecting free speech, but not allowing it to go past the point where it threatens violence or harm against others.
One topical question that's coming up, which is where the 2020 census is coming up, which means that states are going to be redrawing district lines soon. And we have an initiative actually here in New Hampshire for an independent redistricting commission. Yeah. And the question is, what are your thoughts on how we ensure fair redistricting?
It's a great question, and I hope New Hampshire does it. The last count I saw was that there were 13 states, and after the 2018 elections, there may be more states that actually have this nonpartisan, independent, or bipartisan commission form of redistricting. People often ask, they ask me today, I'm sure they're asking all of the candidates, they say, what are you going to do to help bridge this division that exists? Everything is so polarized today. And President Obama was a good example, I think. President Obama oftentimes would not even say the word Republican. Y'all may remember this, right? Because he wanted to try and bridge this divide, right? At the same time, what he found was this other side that was bound and determined to make sure that they opposed him at every turn. And you find folks that, that guy that yelled, "You lie," Joe Wilson, remember that in the middle of the State of the Union? And then he raised like $1 million in the next couple of days after that. That sometimes the system is rewarding this extremism. So I tell people, one of the ways that we reduce that is through independent redistricting, so that the politicians can't select their people, but the people are able to truly select the politicians. And to do that, you need a neutral or independent form of redistricting. The way that I would do it is we would see if we can tie federal funding in some way to states to encourage them to move to an independent redistricting system. My home state of Texas is one of the worst examples of this. I don't know if y'all know Lloyd Doggett, who represents the district that goes from Austin to San Antonio. Lloyd's district, it goes from downtown Austin, and part of it is snakes down for like 60 miles down I-35, and then hits downtown San Antonio. Two communities that are an hour and 20 minutes apart. They're not communities of interest for those of y'all that know redistricting lingo, right? They're so far apart, they're different communities with different needs, but they've done that because Austin is like this bastion of progressivism, and they wanted to weaken the ability of Austin to elect more than one congressional representative in Texas. And it's shameful. If we're being honest, We also have seen some, but I think less, but some examples of Democratic redistricting that has done that too. I think you just need to make it independent. And I also believe, as somebody who is a Democrat, that if we do that, I actually think the Democrats are going to come out ahead. Because when people hear the ideas, when people are not encouraged to be on the extremes, I actually like our chances with the ideas and the proposals, the aspirations that we have for our country.
We have time for just a couple more questions, so I really want to give audience members a chance. Yeah.
Civil liberties are being challenged in the name of security, I feel. For example, one of my colleagues in ministry in the United Church of Christ, her passport has been flagged so that she cannot do humanitarian work in Mexico anymore. This recently happened. I would like to know, and I think that, and I understand that our Homeland Security and a lot of our law enforcement is being trained in these techniques and tactics by the Israeli Defense Force. And there's a lot of exchange going on, a lot of training. I'd like to know how you would respond to that and work with that issue.
Well, which part of it?
Well, the fact that that we're using the Israeli Defense Force as a training ground for our police forces, and both the local police forces and the state and Homeland Security people.
Well, I mean, I think that we need to demilitarize our local police departments as it is. You know, I don't see the reason that many of these police departments have what, you know, basically the machinery of war in their arsenal. And I believe, in fact, that sometimes that, not all the time, but sometimes that is encouraged, almost incentivized them to make use of that machinery when they don't have to. Right? So in general, I think that we should demilitarize those police departments. As to your specific question about any training, yeah, I wouldn't say that I'm categorically against our police departments training with our military or with another military. We do a lot of joint training, military to military. But I don't think that policing in this country should be approached as a military endeavor. I think that's the wrong mindset. So if that's the purpose of it, I disagree with it. If the purpose is to sharpen the skills of police officers for policing, then I'd be willing to consider that, and as president, maybe be willing to support funding of that, but not something that puts police departments into a military mindset, because that is not their job. And in fact, as a city councilman and as mayor of San Antonio, what I saw was that we get the best results in terms of reducing crime, improving quality of life and the ability of people to reach their potential when we engage the community in community policing, when police officers are on the ground, when they're striking up relationships with mothers and fathers and grandparents and the kids that play out in the street, playing basketball or at the rec center or wherever they are. We would do much better to invest in that than to invest in the machinery of war.
Can I ask one? There was one written question actually that hits upon what you just said, which is, how would you incentivize police departments to recruit new police officers from impacted communities?
Yeah, no. There was a program in San Antonio that essentially and now I'm forgetting, I think it was called now I'm losing the name. But this program essentially would go and recruit high schoolers in distressed neighborhoods to pair up with police officers and go on ride-arounds with them. Now, of course, these were age-appropriate ride-arounds, but I think it was called the Explore program. But essentially, and they had this for firefighters and also police officers and a couple of other careers. One of the ideas was to take folks who are in these neighborhoods that too oftentimes are over-policed. Too oftentimes the folks in these neighborhoods maybe are treated differently than people in more affluent neighborhoods. It introduces them to policing, and it helps create a pipeline of young people who have an interest. This is an interest they have themselves. This is not compulsory. This is, they're interested in going into policing. And it's great because it creates a greater pipeline of people who are not afraid of the folks who live in poor neighborhoods or live in mostly minority neighborhoods. That's not an indictment of all police, because I don't think all police are afraid, but I do think that the violence that we see sometimes is because of the misunderstanding or the fear, and sometimes the bigotry that exists toward young black men or young brown men or women in this country. So I would fund efforts like that start from people in high school who want to be in that career, or if they're at community college or after that, to recruit. In addition to all of the other things that police departments do right now, and looking at some of the standards that we've set that had a disproportionate impact or disparate impact on keeping out women and people of color over the years. A classic example of this, remember being, strength tests that didn't really relate over the years to what you had to do in the job, or height tests that some departments used to have that kept out a lot of women and kept out, some communities. All of those things. So we need to look across the board at how we can better recruit from those areas, and also continue to look at the standards and make an extra effort also just traditionally to recruit more women, more people of color. And the last thing I'll say about this is better understand the psychological profile of people that are recruited into police departments. I think that we can do a better job of that, because too often times we found that it's a relatively small number of officers that actually are the ones that continue to have issues. And a lot of times they may have an anger issue or something else that should have been picked up on in the recruitment process, the hiring process. So we need to continue to get better about that. And we would fund and incentivize through the Department of Justice getting there. All right?
Excellent. We have time for one more. An enthusiastic hand raised here.
Yes, I'm just curious what your position is on ranked choice voting.
It's a great question. Let me start off by saying that I have not seen yet a ton of results about ranked choice voting. My inclination is that I like it, I agree with it. Yeah, ranked choice voting. So basically, and we know how usually voting works, that you have a general election, and then if nobody gets more than 50% or 50 plus 1 of the vote, you have a runoff, right? That's traditionally how things work. Ranked choice voting is that you get to rank your choices 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. There's whatever the number of candidates in the race are, and then it's basically in rounds. If nobody gets 50 plus 1 in the first round, then the person that gets the least, I think, is eliminated, and it's run again based on people's second choices. And then if nobody wins, it goes and includes people's third choices, and so on and so forth.
Only you go to the second choice for the people that gets eliminated. Everyone else stays on their first.
There you go.
That's
yeah.
That's important.
So, places like, I think, Minneapolis, Maine have adopted this. My inclination is that that's helpful because it's a fuller expression of the voter's intent from the very beginning. But my honest answer is that I'm not 100% able to commit to that right now, because I will take the time, but have not taken the time so far to look at all of the implications of that. What I want is to make sure that the true will of the voters is done, is reflected. And I do think, in general, that that's the case with ranked choice voting, but I want to educate myself a little bit more on the different implications of it if we used it in a broad way in national elections. So.
Well, I want to thank everybody for coming tonight. And before you leave, I'm going to take 1 minute to plug what we call the ACLU voter campaign. The ACLU is running a campaign this primary to elevate civil rights into the presidential primary narrative with events just like this one. This was a wonderful discussion. I appreciate every single question that was incredibly civil liberties driven. So if you're interested in joining this incredible campaign as an ACLU voter, I encourage you to check out our website, which is www.aclu-nh.org. We also have a number of organizers that are around the room. You're welcome to say hi to them. They would love to sign you up to volunteer with us. And please keep an eye out. We'll be doing more of these candidate series as candidates come through our state. So please help me in giving a round of applause to Secretary Castro.
Thank you very much.